the Resistance, report to your nearest intake facility immediately. We promise nothing nefarious will befall you.
Ratchet and Clank has been a valuable member of Sony's exclusive lineup starting in 2002, after Insomniac Games moved on from the Spyro series for the PlayStation 1. They already made a reputation for themselves as a fantastic 3D platforming developer due to the popularity of their trilogy featuring the small purple dragon. Those games were so immensely loved and acclaimed, they would eventually get complete remakes and receive similar praise all over again. With the approach of a new generation of consoles, however, they decided to look ahead at bigger and better things. Ever since the launch of the first Ratchet and Clank game, the series has been shockingly consistent in quality, offering either graphical improvements or small new gameplay ideas with each new installment, while maintaining its central philosophy of simply being fun and explosive. Some people may complain about a lack of evolution and consider it a symptom of Insomniac Games not knowing how to innovate, but I disagree. If there's one franchise in this entire industry I can point to that stands as the most prominent textbook example of the phrase, "if it ain't broke, don't fix it," it's Ratchet and Clank. I feel like Ratchet and Clank is often overlooked in discussions about the best video game franchises ever, and I kind of understand why. It's not like it created its own genre or introduced any particularly groundbreaking ideas that no one else could have eventually come up with. Even I'm guilty of excluding it from those conversations, and I've played every single Insomniac-developed game in this series. But it feels a bit dismissive of its impressive track record spanning almost 20 years to just brush it aside as some simple platformer that the serious gamers don't care about. Over and over again, Ratchet and Clank games have displayed remarkable competency in combat design, weapon design, planet design, characters, and humor. Some games are still better than others, of course, but if you were to ask me if there were any among the canon games made by Insomniac that I outright dislike, I would struggle to name one, because I generally like all of them. The first game in 2002, Going Commando, Up Your Arsenal, Deadlocked, Tools of Destruction, A Crack in Time, Quest for Booty, Into the Nexus, the remake/reboot. I do have a preference for a few of them, but overall I enjoyed every single one. Following the release of the remake/reboot in 2016, which was intended to be a companion game to the Ratchet and Clank movie, the series was missing in action for a bit, as it seemed like Insomniac Games was simultaneously diversifying their lineup with smaller projects and going full steam ahead on their upcoming and highly anticipated Spider-Man game, which launched in 2018. And just shy of a year after, it was revealed, after many years of being close partners, that the company was finally acquired by Sony, effectively placing them among a dozen other studios that make up the Sony Interactive Entertainment sphere. The transaction apparently cost Sony $229 million. To be frank, that seems like a steal, because in the short amount of time since the acquisition, Insomniac has already proven themselves to be an incredible asset to the development of PlayStation's first-party lineup. And now, that includes a brand new Ratchet & Clank title after 5 years of waiting following the one-off reboot, 8 years following the last canon game, and 12 years following the last canon full-length game. So it's been a hell of a long wait for fans to finally get a new installment for the original continuity. Aiming to take full advantage of the technology boasted by the PlayStation 5, Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart wants to kick the generation off with an impressive bang. Does it succeed? Well, how about we finally dive into the review to find out. Rift Apart takes place sometime after the events of 2013's Into the Nexus for the PlayStation 3. It opens with a scene featuring an alternate dimension in which Emperor Nefarious rules the galaxy, and a group of Resistance members fight to free themselves from his literal and figurative iron-fisted reign. It also introduces a brand new character to the franchise, and a Lombax at that, Rivet, who is basically this dimension's counterpart of Ratchet. We then switch over to the normal dimension that we're already familiar with, and we see our titular heroes being celebrated by a massive parade led by none other than franchise familiars Captain Quark, Skid, and Rusty Pete. However, the affair is cut short when hired goons decide to crash the party, and Ratchet and Clank must once again take up explosive arms to defend themselves and save the planet. It's soon revealed that this dimension's Dr. Nefarious is back once again and hoping to steal the newly built Dimensionator, constructed by Clank, to transport himself and our heroes to an alternate timeline where he's the one who wins. After the Dimensionator goes haywire, that's unfortunately what happens. Ratchet and Clank are set spinning across worlds, eventually landing into Emperor Nefarious's dimension. Now they have to find a way to bring themselves and their Nefarious back to their own universe. It's a pretty straightforward story that allows for a lot of interesting cross-dimension antics to happen. And it's worth mentioning that while Rift Apart is technically a follow-up to an 8-year-old game, Insomniac made sure that this would still function as a jumping-off point for those who either haven't played a Ratchet and Clank game in a very long time, or ever before. There are some references to past plots, but that's really all they are, references. The game doesn't assume you know the previous canon games like the back of your hand in order to understand or appreciate what's happening. That said, people who are familiar with the older games might find enjoyment in the occasional wink and nudge the story gives them. In regard to characters, there are two new faces that definitely stand out the most. The first is Rivet, the female Lombax featured in the game's announcement trailer and Ratchet's alternate dimension counterpart. She made waves among the fanbase pretty much the instant she was introduced last year, and she honestly lives up to the hype. She's an adventurous member of the Resistance against Emperor Nefarious, and she's more than ready to fight when the situation calls for it. Unlike Ratchet, however, she has a bit of a troubled relationship with robots, considering the universe she lives in. But in terms of design and personality, she's a very enjoyable presence. The second new face worth mentioning is someone who wasn't featured as much in promotional material, but is just as important. Kit, a little yellow robot who serves as Clank's alternate dimension counterpart, who shares many of the same traits as him. Together, Rivet and Kit share the spotlight of main characters just as much as Ratchet and Clank do, and the game doesn't suffer for it at all, because they're both more than capable of carrying a game on their own. In fact, it's arguable that this game is more Rivet and Kit's than it is Ratchet and Clank's, which is cool with me because we've had a lot of adventures with the usual pair. I don't know for sure if Insomniac is preparing for a spin-off just for them, but if they are, I'm completely down for it. The support characters in this game are no different either. They have a lot of personality, and despite the mere minutes of screen time some of them get, they leave a positive impression thanks to a combination of good physical design, amusing humor, and fantastic voice acting. This even extends to nameless goons or background NPCs that merely have idle chatter amongst each other or make passing comments to our heroes. Rift Apart has a lot of life in it, not just in its worlds, but in each and every character, whether they're crucial to the plot or just hapless nobodies. When you first start up the game, you're given many options. First, there's difficulty, which not only gives a description of how tough each setting is, but also gives stats on how enemy strength and aggression change between each, which is something that Insomniac has been doing for a while now, and I wish more games did this because sometimes difficulty descriptions are so insanely vague and don't offer any insight into what exactly is being changed. After that, there's the rest of the video, audio, and accessibility settings, of which there are a ton. Insomniac has been putting a lot of work into giving as many adjustable settings as they can, but Rift Apart offers such an incredible amount of options for each category that it makes a lot of PC games blush with embarrassment. For me, while I might not necessarily be hard of hearing, I care a lot about a game's subtitles. They're the very first thing I look for when I turn on a new game, and I'm always irritated when they're not on by default. In Rift Apart, you're given the ability to not only change the size of the subtitles, but also the opacity of the subtitle backgrounds and the color of both the speaker's name and the dialogue itself. And that's just a tiny taste of what you can do with the settings. Now, of course, among these settings is graphical quality. We should expect from here on out that it'll probably become standard for games to offer multiple different performance settings, one that prioritizes graphical fidelity and one that prioritizes frame rate. Rift Apart is no different in this respect. But it does differ in the sense that it offers 3 settings to choose from: quality, performance, and performance ray tracing. Each one has a distinct purpose with their own advantages and disadvantages, but I still think there's a clear winner among the 3. First, there's Quality Mode, which prioritizes a 4K resolution and keeps ray tracing enabled, but limits the game to 30 frames per second. Then there's performance, which prioritizes 4K and 60 frames per second while completely sacrificing the ray tracing. Then there's performance ray tracing, which lowers the resolution down to 1440p, keeps the ray tracing, and maintains 60 frames per second. You can probably already guess which of these three that I'm going to champion, but regardless, I'll make it clear. Performance ray tracing is the way to play this game. It's easy to assume that going from 4K to 1440p is some drastic loss in sharpness, but it's really not. If you put your controller down and lean in towards your television and squint a bit, then yes, you might be able to make out some slightly blurry edges, but it's virtually imperceptible when you're actually playing the game like normal. You won't miss those extra rendered pixels at all when you're in the middle of blowing stuff up. The only instance you would ever choose quality mode, assuming you care about the choice at all, is if you're one of those people with bad eyes and genuinely can't tell the difference between 30 and 60 frames per second. You might be wondering, but what about normal performance mode? Good question. What about it? The existence of performance ray tracing mode makes the existence of regular performance mode completely unnecessary and utterly superfluous. Yeah, normal performance mode does run at 4K, but that's at the cost of the significantly more important ray tracing. Seriously, this game is drop-dead gorgeous with ray tracing turned on. It's still very pretty even without it, but ray tracing simply transcends it to a new level. The game is loaded with curved glass assets and metallic surfaces that take a marked amount of advantage of the ray tracing, and it adds so much more life and detail to both character models and the environment. I did do some switching between graphical settings just to compare, but to me, there is no comparison. Performance ray tracing is the way to go, 9 times out of 10. I feel so spoiled by the existence of this graphical setting that I'm probably going to be disappointed every time I hear of a game that doesn't have it. To go into greater detail about the graphical fidelity of the actual game assets, Rift Apart is seriously a true next-gen marvel. Textures are so high quality and sharp, the fur on Ratchet and Rivet is distinguishable by strand. Every planet is dense with environmental assets, and some feature remarkably busy cityscapes and horizon that are awe-striking from a distance. If you've kept up with the reception of this game like I have, you've probably seen many comparisons to a Pixar movie. Admittedly, it's easy to think that such a statement is ridiculous if you haven't sat down and experienced the game yourself, but there's some key context here that does warrant it. Pixar movies are exactly that, movies. They're pre-rendered, and that rendering process sometimes takes hours for just one frame. Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart, however, is a video game. These assets you see in front of you are not pre-rendered. They're real, interactable models that you can directly control or influence. For such incredible detail to be achieved in something that isn't pre-rendered just goes to show how far this medium has come technologically. I have a strong feeling that 7 years from now, Rift Apart will still be looked back on as one of the best looking games of this new generation. The impressive performance doesn't just stop at visuals. There's loading times, which have been a huge conversation ever since the announcement trailer for this game, showcasing the real-time set piece of Ratchet and Clank falling through multiple dimension holes into new worlds, where the entire stage changes every few seconds. Entirely new assets, new lighting, no clever tricks. Some disbelievers said that it was somehow exaggerated or maybe outright faked, but now that the game is in our hands, we now know for sure that it wasn't. As a matter of fact, the final product performs even better than the trailer did for the same sequence. The loading times are impeccable. They're virtually non-existent. There's multiple planets that have the gimmick of switching between dimensions on the fly, where they look drastically different from one another, with totally switched out assets, different enemies, and a new skybox and horizon line. You simply smack a crystal, the game fades to white for 1 second, and you're in a totally different world. I would bet money that Insomniac created this mechanic solely to show off the SSD's speed, and it does a damn good job of doing that. It's insane. There's been plenty of games I've played on PS5 that managed to pull off loading times short enough for me to call them near instant. But Rift Apart is the closest I've seen so far to reaching the coveted label of actually instant. And still, the performance doesn't stop there. There's also the haptic feedback within the DualSense. in which the triggers are utilized in a way that crosses your typical varying trigger weight with the half pull and full pull mechanic seen in Returnal last month. Within the body of the controller, there's equally impressive feedback. If you own a PS5, you've likely played Astro's Playroom, and you know what the haptic feedback feels like when you're walking on different surfaces. Rift Apart utilizes that too. There's tiny vibrations with each step Ratchet and Rivet take, and additional vibrations that vary in intensity depending on what weapon you fire and how far it lands. Then there's the audio, which is richly detailed and comes from every possible angle when you're playing with headphones on. It's truly impressive. Rift Apart does an absolutely masterful job of utilizing every conceivable technological piece of the PS5's capabilities. Insomniac really knocked it out of the park when it came to giving the impression that this game simply isn't possible on PlayStation 4. In terms of performance and features, this is a truly next-gen game, and definitely sets the bar for what other first-party titles can hopefully achieve. The gameplay of Rift Apart is pretty straightforward, and has stayed that way for a very long time. The series has a pretty no-nonsense formula that it's always stuck by, and for the most part, that's been the right decision. You run, jump, and shoot your way to the end of the game, brandishing a variety of weapons that range from a fairly standard pistol to handheld weapons of mass destruction. Guns with personality have always been a franchise staple, and nothing about that changes here. There are simple things like the electrifying Executor, which is essentially the game's shotgun, and the Headhunter, a sniper rifle that can slow down time. But then there's the trademark Ratchet and Clank silliness in stuff like the Topiary Sprinkler, which is a defensive tool that momentarily turns enemies into immobilized hedges, and the Drill Hound, an explosive ordnance that shoots giant drills that hunt down targets while barking like dogs. Whether you want to maim, blast, stun, or simply distract, there's something here for everyone, and they're pretty much all fun to use and have their own purpose in a fight. Furthermore, they're upgradable, just as always, by leveling them up through usage, which unlocks more upgrade nodes that you spend Raritanium on. Speaking of equipment, there's more than just weapons to look forward to. Rift Apart gives us armor sets, each consisting of 3 parts: helmet, body, and boots. Each different set has its own special effect, such as reducing damage from specific enemy types or increasing the amount of experience, bolts, or Raritanium picked up. And the more pieces of an armor set you have, the greater the effect. Furthermore, you don't have to equip all pieces of one set if you don't wish to, meaning you can mix and match. As the cherry on top, you can also edit the colors of your armor by selecting among a decent variety of color palettes. It's a nice system that adds an extra layer of rewards for thorough completion of the game and exploration for collectibles, which include the staple gold bolts. The more gold bolts you find, the more cosmetic features you unlock in the game, including wrench and hammer skins for Ratchet and Rivet, bolt skins which turn the game's currency into something else, including cans of energy drinks, visual filters that change the look of the game, a mirror mode that switches every level horizontally, and even photo mode stickers. The game throws rewards at you by the armful for simply doing what any platforming game would expect you to do anyway: collect things. When it comes to mobility, the series has mostly depended on the basic platforming mechanics: running, double jumping, and occasional grapple hooking. Those things are still here, but Rift Apart spices things up a bit in the movement department by adding a few new things. First, a true dodge, which grants a small window of invincibility and can be done both on foot and in the air. And second, a wall run, which is used quite liberally in platforming-heavy portions of the game. Another twist is thrown into the usual grapple hook mechanic with rifts, which allow Ratchet or Rivet to quickly teleport to a different spot in the room by pulling in a hole in space-time, offering a brief reprieve from aggressive enemies. And finally, there's hover boots, which are mainly for getting around a large area in a short amount of time, because there's a few planets that have big, openly explorable areas as opposed to more linear layouts. It speaks a lot on the quality of the movement in a platforming game where the act of simply going from place to place in a level isn't a chore or something you wish to avoid. Rift Apart keeps the experience from becoming too dull with planet designs that aren't just pretty to look at, but also fun to navigate through, though with one small exception. There's a short couple of sequences, specifically on the planet Sargasso, that involves riding a flying creature named Trudy to acquire certain collectibles. Unfortunately, controlling Trudy is nowhere near as fun and engaging as controlling Ratchet or Rivet by themselves. She's difficult to turn and you can't land her anywhere you choose. But of course, the game isn't just about your good old-fashioned jumpin' and shootin'. There's a couple of mini-games to partake in too. One of which, admittedly, does involve more shooting, but of a different type. And this minigame is essentially Rift Apart's version of a hacking minigame. Every once in a while you'll encounter virus-infected terminals that Ratchet will send a tiny digitized robot named Glitch into, and then Control moves over to her in this tiny virtual space, littered with tiny virus-like creatures and nests to destroy. Glitch functions like a six-legged tank. She can crawl on every surface of the stage, meaning you'll be walking on walls and ceilings, but she can't jump. She's armed with multiple different types of weaponry, and the minigame ends once all nests are destroyed. It's a fun little distraction that keeps up the bombastic action of the normal game while still feeling like a different experience at its core. The second minigame is puzzle-based and includes controlling Clank. If you've played past Ratchet and Clank games, then you can probably guess, just by that piece of information, that this minigame will involve manipulating the environment or tiny minions of some sort to reach a goal, and that's exactly what it is. In Clank's minigame, he's between dimensions to clear out unstable rifts, and by using special orbs that shift the environment, he can direct clones of himself to the end of a stage. It's a very interesting little deviation from the rest of the game, and although these puzzles aren't terribly difficult, they don't feel like a chore or an interference. I actually kinda looked forward to doing them when I knew they were coming up. Beyond those two mini-games comes another Ratchet and Clank staple, the Coliseum. Almost every single installment in this franchise has some kind of Coliseum planet or location where the sole purpose of its existence is to simply offer extra opportunities for carnage, with varying levels of difficulty but increasing rewards, often ending in some sort of dramatic boss fight or gauntlet for the very last challenge. In fact, one game was entirely that, Deadlocked for the PS2. A Coliseum is present here in Rift Apart as well, but this is one of the few aspects where I felt the game missed its mark. The challenges in Rift Apart's obligatory arena are pretty lackluster. There's a half-decent variety of goals to achieve, but there's a distinct lack of character within those battles. None of them really stand out as impressive or particularly engrossing, except perhaps the very few amount of boss fights. Once you beat the game for the first time, you also unlock the traditional Challenge mode, which is essentially New Game Plus. You carry over your weapons, bolts, armor, and collectible rewards, and are tasked with completing the game yet again with tougher enemies and the chance to purchase Omega versions of all the weapons you fully leveled up, allowing them to become even stronger than ever. So the game doesn't necessarily have to end when you hit the end credits. If you wish to hoard more powerful weaponry and wreak more havoc, then you're more than welcome to do so. Overall, Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart will feel very familiar to those who already have experience with the series, and that's a good thing, generally speaking. There's a couple of small weaknesses in the game, but it definitely stands among the best in the series. But the experience is truly elevated by the amazing technical feats and performance that Insomniac was able to achieve. The game isn't just fun and rewarding, it's also beautiful to look at, to listen to, and to literally feel in the palm of your hands. Without a doubt, it sets the bar high for what Sony first-party games can achieve in the future. If this is a game we can get within the first 8 months of the generation, then I can only imagine what we may get in 3 more years or so, and that's assuming Insomniac hasn't managed to squeeze out every trick and feature they can muster already. Rift Apart flatly states that it isn't a game that's possible on last-gen hardware, because it's not. Not without sucking the life out of what makes so much of the game a worthwhile experience. The jaw-dropping graphical fidelity, the incredible haptic feedback, the mesmerizing audio, and the breakneck loading times. This is, undeniably, the most next-gen feeling game I've experienced so far on my PlayStation 5, and I look forward to more. This concludes my review of Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you around.
Not again! At least it was a round trip. am trying to destroy you as fast as I can.